So, well, why don't we have just everyone spend like a couple sentences explaining who they are and a little bit about themselves. And so I'll start. My name is Eun Lee. I'm the founder of The Dream Unfinished, which is a symphonic benefit for civil rights. The concert that you're at right now is a part of a chamber concert leading up to the headline event that we're having on July 17th. Outside of The Dream Unfinished, I'm a music educator. I teach at the Corona Youth Music Project as well as the Panelists School of Music, and I'm also a clarinetist. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay. My name is Jessica McJunkins. I am a violinist in New York. I perform all over the city with Wordless Music Orchestra, Symphony Ensemble, and various other performing arts organizations. And outside of performing, I teach at Opus 118 School of Music in East Harlem. And I'm originally from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Hello, my name is Ramirez. I am from Corona, New York, born and raised here. I'm a clarinetist. I work at the Corona Youth Music Project along with Eun. I'm a woodwinds teacher there as well as the program coordinator. And aside from that, I teach lessons, do tutoring, do a little bit of everything involving kids and working with them.
My name is David Bloom, and I'm a conductor. I focus on music by living composers, and I'm co-artistic director and co-founder of Contemporaneous, which is a New York-based ensemble of 21 musicians that's all about the most exciting music by living composers. And I also do a lot of teaching and freelance conducting and opera.
My name is Kyle Walker. I'm a pianist, and I teach as well all throughout New York City at 3 different schools. One is the Fort Lee School of Music in New Jersey. The next one is Wi-Fi Music School, which is an online music school, and Music School of NYC, where I travel to students for lessons. And I'm really excited to be part of the Dream Unfinished. It actually kind of coincides with a project that I'm doing by myself called Black Notes, which is a solo piano project with kind of the same sort of mission, civil rights issues and this sort of thing. So I'm really proud to be part of this project.
I'm hearing from our internet audiences that it's too quiet, so if everyone could speak up, except maybe David, because he's in the mic.
My name is Burt Basin. I think that's a good volume. I am a trombonist. I also work with the Salvation Army, and we're going to actually be having the event, The Dream Unfinished, at my hall, Centennial Memorial Temple. Performance-wise, I'm principal trombone of the Chamber Orchestra of New York. I also sub with the New York Philharmonic from time to time. And as of today, I was appointed as trombone instructor at the Juilliard School of Music for their music advancement program. So I'm pretty excited about that.
So now that we're all introduced, I wanted to just introduce this panel discussion, and we are having a talk about race issues in classical music. And so the first question that I'd like to present to our panelists is how has race, if at all, influenced or affected role models that you have found in your training as a classical musician? So who wants to jump in?
So when I was a kid, my mother primarily, my dad was a jazz musician. He played jazz percussion. But my mother played piano when she was a child and never really did anything with it. My parents are visual artists. But when I was 8, I saw a little boy playing the violin on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I had never touched a violin, but I told my mom I was better than him. And so, so that's how I got lessons. But carrying on that tradition, my mother went to the library and just tried to search through the CDs and the cassettes then, that they had available, and she asked people specifically for classical music performers who were black. And they pointed her to Regina Carter, who's a very prominent jazz violinist. And I loved the music of Regina Carter, but it was really hard to find black classical musicians to look up to. And so what ended up happening is when I was about, I'm not sure, late teens, I saw Patrice Jackson Tillman play cello with the symphony orchestra, and I was absolutely floored. And so it wasn't until then that I actually see notable black classical performers. And so I really looked up to her, which I've never told her, even though we work together now all the time. But I really looked up to her, and I'd say that was a big part of it. But it was definitely not something that was readily available at the time, or at least the internet wasn't around so much, and so I couldn't just look that up and find that online. So the few performers that I did find, I was glued to. But yeah, it was hard. Yeah.
Yeah, so I also grew up in the South, in North Carolina, and part of, I guess I had not so much an opposite experience, but part of my experience was growing to find out that I was black. So I would go to piano competitions kind of as a little kid, not really competitions, but you go just kind of compete with yourself. But more or less, my piano teacher would say, okay, you've got to, and she was not black, but she was very apparent that I was the one that was standing out. So she would tell me, okay, you've got to beat the Asians and the white people, and because you're the only black person, so you've got to represent for the black community. But I didn't really think about the fact that I was black until she brought it up, and even my parents, it wasn't really that big of a thing. So it actually was kind of more society that made me feel like I was something different.
And how did that influence your looking for role models?
Well, with role models, I think it's funny because even today, sometimes I'll come across a black musician, and I'll try and find out all I can about them. I'm like, oh, this person looks successful, and then I find myself sometimes getting obsessed with their person, with just themselves as a person, mainly because of their skin color, rather than their musicality. And that's a dangerous thing to be in, because it shouldn't be about race necessarily, though that has a lot to do with it, and so it's great, but at the same time, I wish I could sometimes just close my eyes and listen to what do I really like, rather than who do I really like to watch.
Sure, I'll jump in. As growing up as a young black musician, particularly trained in classical, it's very difficult to find a role model that you can identify with. And we all know when we're young, our peers carry a lot of weight in their opinion and things that they do and say. So for me, I'm one that generally doesn't go with, the majority of what kids are doing. When I was growing up, hip hop was kind of, I'm gonna date myself now, was when everybody had the big radio on their shoulders and, fat boys were in and all that kind of stuff. But I can say that I grew up in the deep South, because I came from Jamaica, then moved to Arkansas. But my musical journey didn't start till when I moved here to New York and Brooklyn. And at that time, that was probably the heart, of a lot of what was going on with hip hop. But I was the one that was following Canadian brass and Empire brass. And the response there is what I got in school. It wasn't cool, and until I discovered Wynton Marsalis, that's probably one that young black brass players anyone will grab as a role model really quickly. But Wynton does classical probably better than anyone, but he also does jazz better than anyone, and I've come to realize that if you talk about Wynton, if you talk about Duke Ellington, and several other prominent musicians, even though they do classical, they're still very quickly branded as being jazz musicians. So it becomes a bit of an issue to find a role model that you can readily identify with, that fits in with your crowd and your crew at school and all that stuff. So that's.
Well, I think being from New York City, I think I had more of that advantage of having the diversity, around me. So I never really thought about it as a young person, and I immediately started at the MAP program. That's where I got started, so I was already surrounded by great role models like Imani Wins. And there are people I still keep in touch with, and I feel like I can connect with them. So, it's not something I realized until maybe a little bit later because I was fortunate enough to have those people put in front of me right off the bat. So now, as an older person and an educator, performer, I'm becoming more of that person who wants to be that role model because I realize that, it's not as easy for kids to have that access.
Yeah, thank you. So for the original question, I'll say that race didn't really affect my finding in a role model, but I'm a, let's call it a former clarinetist. One of my role models as a clarinetist is Anthony McGill. And I had the opportunity when I was 17 or so to have a master class with him, and will cherish that experience for my entire life. And I also had an amazing sort of closing of the circle in that case, or hopefully a continuation of that circle, when my students at a high school where I teach in New York had a master class with him. And this was in front of the entire school, which is a very diverse school. It's a special music school, high school. Really fantastic program that has great instruction for kids from all boroughs and of all instruments. And so everyone in the high school was there in the auditorium, and when Anthony McGill walked in, everybody just went crazy. They were really excited he was introduced as the principal clarinetist of the New York Philharmonic and formerly of the Metropolitan Opera, and a very prestigious career, and they were very excited to see Anthony walk in.
And for those viewers and listeners that don't know, Anthony McGill is the principal clarinetist of the New York Philharmonic, and he's also one of the few African-American musicians that is employed by the New York Philharmonic. Right. Next question. What, if any, race-based stereotypes have you faced as a musician?
Sure. I'll just start with my earliest, where I realized that it was a stereotype, and then I'll tell you my latest. So I was pretty good in high school, and I was fortunate as I think must have been a sophomore to get into one of the all-state groups for New York, and I think it was probably the band, all-state band that year. And as with all of these seminars and symposiums and stuff, there's music stores that set up displays and all that kind of stuff. So my friend and I were looking at sheet music, and a security guard walks up to me and accuses me of having something in my pocket. He told me to take the tape out of my pocket. Again, I'm dating myself. Cassette tapes were, around at that time. Anyway, and I looked around and I'm like, what are you talking about? And it became a scene, and everybody's watching, and he's accusing me of having, of me stealing a tape. So of course I emptied my pockets and I continued the scene to prove that I didn't take anything. You shouldn't, just accuse somebody because you think they look like they may, and then that was ages ago. My most recent stereotype, and this happens a lot, especially being a trombone player, because trombones are versatile, and there's a revolution that's happening that many and I are aware of. But being a trombonist, you can play a lot of different styles. You can play classical, you can play jazz, R&B, and being at the airport on a trip that I was taking maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, I encountered a couple while having a snack before the flight, and they saw my instrument and asked what I do. I told them I play trombone, and they just branded me as a jazz musician, even though I told them I play with orchestras, and what I'm about to do is an orchestral gig. And they told me, they were from Chicago, and they were telling me about jazz clubs there and places, street corners that I could play on. you know, and I mean, I had to laugh it off, but I said that's not really what I do. I usually wear a tuxedo, you know, and with a conductor in front of me, but it didn't seem to register. But that's a stereotype that I get quite, that I'm a jazz musician, no matter how much I explain that I'm not.
Anyone else want to jump?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect example with myself as well. Just because of the jazz thing, people are always like, "Do you play jazz?" And I mean, I love jazz, and probably second to classical, that's probably what I listen to most is jazz. And when I'm by myself in my room by myself, I probably try and dabble with jazz by myself. But you know, I somebody just asked me yesterday if I could play a jazz concert in March, and I'm like, maybe since it's by March, maybe I can figure it all out by then. I don't know. So I had to like kind of turn it down. But it's either that or church music, and which is a huge part of the black community. It's, I mean, so regardless of if you're religious or not, you kind of have to have some sort of, I don't know, I mean, I can't speak for all black people, obviously, but it seems to be that there's always this fundamental, you know, church-going feeling of the black community that if somebody dies, you're expected to always know how to play every hymn, like, all by ear, like, which is fine, like, I can do that, but that's because I grew up in a black church. But not all black people can do that, and that's just kind of like what's expected. So actually on the opposite side, part of what I was saying earlier about my Black Notes project is I'm trying to find this music that links you know, black culture to other sorts of Western European culture, particularly since it's classical music. And the hardest thing that I'm finding is that so much of the really good black composers' music is spiritual based, which is fine, but I'm trying to find a big variety, and it's a little bit hard to find that because it's not played very often, and because it's not published, and it's not that it doesn't exist, but it's just very inaccessible. So that's one of the other stereotypes, is just that it's hard to find good classical music that's written by black composers. Of course, that's changing today too. Daniel Bernard Romain, I mean, Anthony McGill, who's not a composer, but you know, some of the people that are kind of shedding light on the non-stereotypes, which is good, but that's always kind of a fight that I'm facing.
Should we move on to the next question? Or, did you want to say? Yeah.
I play in a string quartet called the West Village Quartet, and we are part of Music Under New York. It was actually founded by David Burnett, who's a very prominent violinist and contractor in the city, and he founded the quartet 34 years ago in New York, and 4 African American men, string players, formed this quartet, and they would play on the street, in the subway. They would busk, as it were. And the story is actually really funny. When they, the whole reason they got their name was because they didn't have one, and they were playing in the West Village, and someone was like, "What is the name of your group? Is it the West Village Quartet?" And they were like, "Yeah." And so, but now it is like one of the more known for commuters, and for anyone in New York who's just around and in the train, and you know, anyone who takes the Long Island Railroad or New Jersey Transit or anything else, they know this particular quartet because we are playing classical music, but we are people of color. And for some reason, in 2015, that is very striking to people. It's very uplifting to people, and for the most part, that's what we get. But sometimes we get people who are not only confused as to why we don't play jazz, or we don't play R&B covers, or we don't play the pop charts. They're not only confused, they're a little belligerent, actually, which is weird. And we find that, and the ironic part is, generally the cops in the subway station are nicer to us than many people who are just walking by. We get we get some heat from people who feel like we shouldn't be playing classical music because it's white music. It's just like a very interesting, in addition to being a great way to shed any nervousness you may have had before you walked in at 7 a.m. But it's also just really interesting socially to get a tab on where people are in relation to how they react. Just you get very raw, real. These aren't like people sitting in a concert hall. You know, they're not even like in a home for a chamber music concert. They're just walking to work, and they're rushed and they're stressed. And so for someone to stop and, you know, make an observation, whether it's misguided or not, is very interesting to see how people react. So you have people who say to us, who ask us why we're playing classical music. You have people who just assume that we're all in school, even though David founded the quartet 34 years ago. And then you have people who are like patronizing in a way, like, good luck, keep trying, you know, things like that. And all of us perform all over the city. Tia Allen's our viola, she plays with On the Town. David and I just played at the UN last night. It's just kind of, and that's clear when we're performing, that we're all professionals. But for some reason, I think that people, I don't know, it's, they think they're hiding it and they're not. And that's probably the most fascinating part, is when people tell on themselves, just through their behavior.
Do you guys want to speak anything to that? And I just remember that I actually had, in addition to that conversation, or that topic, sort of on the opposite end as the Asian model minority. And this will be understood between musicians, but a lot of people, when they look at me, they assume that I play flute, or I play piano, or I play violin, and that I started when I was 4 or 5. And I have to tell them, no, I actually only started taking private lessons when I was 14. So I had a rather late start and a rather difficult start. And so there's that other assumption of, oh, well, you look this way, so things must have been this way for you. I'm going to go to our next question. And there's this really fascinating article that not a lot of people know about that was written by Leonard Bernstein in 1948. And we're actually going to release an extract of that article on our website, thedreamunfinished.org, in the blog. And basically this article was talking about the issues of race in classical music, because back in 1948, the prevailing assumption was that African Americans were not interested in classical music, therefore there were no black classical musicians. And Leonard Bernstein was one of the few people to come forward and say, actually, it's really because of systemic issues and barriers as far as access to proper training and education and role models. And so I wanted to ask our panel, that article was published in 1948, and here we are in 2015. How much has changed since then?
I think that as someone who lives in New York and who sees some programs that make classical music instruction available to minorities, and I can say that at least in New York, there's a lot more access for young people in classical music, and then I know a few programs outside of New York. There are a couple of programs that are involved with this program, the Community Music Works, and they're in Baltimore, the Orc Kids. And there are a few others, Project Step, there are a few El Sistema-inspired programs. My sense is that these are programs that are outliers. These are not, these should be models for programs that are ubiquitous all over the United States at the least. But unfortunately, I think they are the few that we can single out as this is a model for a program that's doing good work. That's what we have. on the education front?
Well, I think that there are definitely more programs, especially here in New York City, that are opening up the doors for minorities and kids of, social, economic backgrounds that wouldn't otherwise allow them to take music lessons, for example. But at the same time, I think that a lot of these programs are trying to put out a product, and I feel like that's what I've realized. I've had a chance to work with a lot of different organizations. And in the end, when you take a close look at the people involved and what the program is trying to do by the end of the school year, for example, all they're trying to do is really put up pretty pictures, a great performance, when the kid really didn't get what they were supposed to get out of the program, which is more than just music, I think, especially with the program that we work with. So that's one thing I've realized. As much as, there's a lot of publicity for these programs that are happening in New York City and many other places, I think a closer look really has to be taken at what that kid is really getting from that program.
And besides education, Bernstein's article also talks about statistically how there are very, very few musicians of color in orchestras and the pits for Broadway and ballet. And Bernstein was one of the few, trailblazers in making sure that musicians and actors of color were employed on Broadway. So if anyone would also want to speak to what those statistics look like now as far as the representation of African American and Latin American and not white American musicians in performing ensembles, if anyone wants to speak to that topic as well.
Sure. I did the best research I could for those kind of statistics for a program that I'm launching called Ovation Concert Series. The most recent data from the League of American Orchestras that I could find was from 2012. So I think it needs updating. At least I need to get better at my research. Those numbers were still quite startling. I mean, compared to what Bernstein might have been referring to, we've probably seen, I don't know, maybe a 200% increase in minority representation in classical music organizations. But when you look at it based on what's out there, it's actually, if you want to talk about African American representation, you're talking about less than 2%. If you're talking about Latino representation, you're talking about slightly over 2%, and then triple that for the Asian representation, which is probably about less than 7%. So all in total, it's still under 10% when you combine all the minorities throughout North America for representation. This is just orchestras, but clearly, if we go to any Broadway show, you're going to see the same reflection in the ballet. You're going to see the same reflection. And, I haven't had a chance to actually look at the article in any depth, but what you've quoted, it's a little, to me, frightening how much it still applies. I can't do the math, but over 50, 60 years later, it's unfortunately still, quite accurate to what's happening in today's society.
Just to add on to that, I think that what Bernstein said was true and eerily to me, it hasn't really changed. But I think a large part of it is that we are, socially, musicians are very aware that that hasn't changed, and they're uncomfortable about it. And so it's not something that's discussed outside of any situation other than this, or anything like this. It's not something that comes up at after concert receptions, or if I'm out with a group of friends, if I'm out of town doing an orchestra gig and I go out with people just to go out with people, and I'm still the only person there, it's not. Anything and everything will come up in conversation except that. And if I bring it up or someone else brings it up, let's not talk about politics. It just makes people very uncomfortable because it is so true. And I think that, just to speak back to education, all of that is tied in. Because the one thing that I have noticed, and the reason why I have stayed with the program that I've stayed with, is because the number of programs for children of color has definitely increased somewhat, but regionally. But the quality is not the same. And the reason why I stay with the program that I stay with is because we give the kids the kind of education that anyone in any pre-college program would have. And I think that you have to break down this idea that no one likes to talk about, which is that I don't think people want children of color to have a lower quality of education, but I do think that it's more of a pump the numbers in sort of situation. And, you know, I just don't think that's going to change until we break that down. And the other thing is, growing up in North Carolina, the first time I saw more than one other musician of color was when I moved to New York, when I was 25. So that was the first time I saw anything like that. And that was a year into being in the city. And it was David Burnett who introduced me to all these people. And I walked into this room of musicians in Charleston, all these New York musicians who came down to Charleston to do a festival for Black classical musicians. And I was just like, I don't understand what's going on. But that's not something that anyone who studies classical music should experience in their mid-20s. And I think what David was saying, that needs to be the standard everywhere. Like, as important as standardized testing or anything else, because something does have to change. But yeah, I mean, I'm just agreeing with all of you.
We're going to move to our last question, and I'm going to ask that we keep our answers a little bit on the brief side in case we have questions from the audience or from hopefully people watching online. So our last question is, what steps do institutions and individuals need to take in order to reach greater diversity in classical music?
Well, I think it all goes back to education. And if you look in any of the New York City schools, in any conservatory or music school throughout the nation, but specifically in the New York City schools, Juilliard, Mannes, Manhattan, NYU, that's a prime example of the numbers. And it's a shame that I, having graduated from Mannes, can count on one hand the amount of Black musicians at Mannes. And I'm sure that it's not very different at the other schools. And if you go around and you ask people, and of course it's different for each instrument. For instance, most pianists didn't start in a school program. I mean, we started with private lessons. And so it depends on instruments, for one, but I think the other thing is that it all starts from the neighborhood. And no matter how many of these programs that are started up, there has to be a one-on-one sort of initiative. And somebody spoke, I think, said regionally it's an issue. And it's absolutely an issue because, look at, again, New York City schools, the majority of people, for one, are out of the country that attend the schools here. So I don't think it's a valid, description of Americans necessarily. Not that it's a problem, but we can't look at New York City music schools and define all of the American child issues on that. So we've got to look outside of New York City, for one, and also into smaller communities. And I mean, there are so many stories about race issues, all civil justice issues that happen in tiny communities, or even maybe not tiny, but look at Charleston. I mean, it's not a huge city, but events like these are happening all the time. And if we go to those tiny little towns that nobody wants to be in the middle of nowhere, that's where we need to be. And so I'm constantly thinking about where I want to see myself as a musician to make a difference in the world, because New York City is a great saturated place to be a musician. There are lots of opportunities, there are lots of little niches. If you're into one particular thing, you can find it anywhere. But if we really want to make a difference, we've got to be willing to go out into the middle of nowhere. where it feels blatantly racist, and we feel extremely uncomfortable, and go into schools and deal with kids one-on-one, and that can be that Anthony McGill moment for all kids.
Right.
And I think that's where it starts. I think that's the seed, because we can have so many education programs, and that's great, but it has to start at home. And we can't blame it on the parents if they don't have access to that, so we have to go do it.
I think that what institutions need to do is to listen. They need to listen to this kind of dialogue, and recognize the proportion issues that we have in the professional classical music world, and tackle that issue from the ground up. I think that the first step that needs to be taken is a recognition that this is a problem.
Well, I think it all starts with having a really diverse personnel, a group of people working from within. If you have an organization that has people that don't come from different backgrounds, and you're expecting to get really good work done with kids that are of minorities, there's really no real way that those people, I think, maybe some, I can't speak for everyone, but they will truly connect with the kids. It begins with the kids if we're talking about education, but I've seen it where kids cannot connect with people who are not of their same background, because at the same time, those people have no real interest in getting to know their culture and where they come from. So that's really hard, and I've seen institutions that, maybe only hire white people, but they're working with Latinos and Blacks, so there's this disconnect, and there's also that, idea of these people going in to work with these kids so that it looks good for them, and so that, and because it's maybe just a gig, the idea of having it just be a gig, and not really be something bigger. Aside from that, I think individuals, people like us, people who really understand what's going on, we really need to remember where we come from, and never really hold back that, so that we can share it with people, because people really do want to know, and if we stand up for it, then it'll really have that impact.
Just to piggyback off of what both of these guys were saying, I think dialogue needs to happen, and if it's an uncomfortable thing, good, because change doesn't really happen until people are uncomfortable. I think that is number one. I think what Kyle said is especially true based on where I'm from, where we are from, North Carolina. And with education specifically, I haven't been teaching for 20 years, but what connects me with my students is that shared experience. And that shared experience enables me to teach them in a way that they feel challenged but understood. And so through that, they understand that if they are coming in and they're overloaded because they have to take care of 30 things that their mother can't help them with because mom's working, or there's like a single father at home, I can kind of understand, not because of the familial background, but because I understand what it's like to have to make sacrifices so that you can get something done to make you better at your craft. Or, I understand, and that I think that speaks way more than just one way of teaching. I think these formulaic ways, like the Systema program and everything, that's great for the intention, but I do think that these programs may be one person to a smaller group of children, so that there's a real active live dialogue that is not just about the music, it's a social acceptance, recognition, and respect of where they come from. So yeah, I would say take it out further, more places, change the face of who's teaching these children so that they have someone to look up to. It shouldn't have to be this one celebrity. You know, they should be able to walk into the school where they take lessons and see a teacher there present that they can look up to. I'd say that would be.
How long has El Sistema been
Well,
around?
El Sistema comes from Venezuela, and it's been around for about 40 years now.
40 years.
Yeah.
But it's recent, relatively recent in
Here
the
in the
United
States,
States.
yeah.
Around
Yeah.
8 or 9 years.
Yeah.
So 8 or 9 years roughly in the States. We have several other organizations that are dedicated to the promotion of diversity in the arts. Two big ones that have been around for pretty much 2 decades, 20 years or so. And we've seen what the numbers have barely budged, almost flatline. And you can, I mean, it's almost like the saying of you can lead a horse to water, but can you make it drink? You can put instruments in the hands of children, minority or not minority. You know, and you can have as many of these programs, but there's one thing that, and this is going to be a plug for my Visiting Artist Series for the Ovation Visiting Artist Series. And when we speak about education, yes, you can get as many children you want into a classroom and teach them, you know, how to hold an instrument and how to make a sound on the instrument. But one thing that I've seen that's lacking in all of this is what the children identify with. And just think about what we've if we've grown up through the school system here in the United States, you know, and studied history. Think about what our society would be if certain things were left out of our history books. If we didn't learn about what Abraham Lincoln did, and Booker T. Washington, and Martin Luther King, what would society be? Where would we be right now? Probably be a lot different. Or if those people didn't do what they did, probably someone else would step in their place. But if those weren't taught in the classroom, things would be a lot different than they are now. Well, that's what's happened when you learn music history. There's a lot of things that are left out. A lot of prominent black composers that are left out, and the ones that are put in. Just look at Duke Ellington. I have two degrees in music, and I didn't learn that Duke Ellington wrote symphonies and did classical things a while after. I didn't learn about the Chevalier de St. George until I was well out of my orchestral performance master's degree, and I had a Caucasian person tell me about this. And recently, Sequita, those who performed on the previous concert, told me she had approached one of our professors, music history professors, at Manhattan School of Music, you know, about Joseph Malone, that's his real name, and the teacher scoffed, saying that would never, you know, he would never take that up. So I say that to say that to see real change, where kids have something to identify with and learn something that hasn't been taught, that has actually happened and has actually influenced people like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So you actually start changing the curriculum and incorporate things that have been omitted for the last, 300 years. You're going to see like the small budge in the needle, but the representation, because the kids' passion and things that they identify with, it's not going to be there. So I think ultimately the curriculum, both at the high school level, definitely at the collegiate level, have to change.
The one thing that I'd like to add really quickly is, because we've talked a lot about educational institutions, but as far as performing arts institutions, I think it's also absolutely crucial that, you know, the New York Philharmonic and Orpheus Chamber Orchestra are programming works by musicians of color. And as Kyle was alluding to a little bit, sometimes it's just so hard to find a recording, and people won't play or study something because it's not on YouTube. And so we just need to, you know, have these materials more readily available, and orchestras need to not play New World Symphony again, but play something else.
There's a spiritual in there.
play something by William Grant Still or by Florence Price. These composers that were exceptionally recognized during their time, but have fallen by the wayside in recent years. So we'd like to, if our cozy audience would like to ask any questions. I also have, I'm not being rude. I'm looking at my phone to see if anyone's asking us questions via Twitter. But if anyone has any questions for our panel.
Well, you were speaking about. Hi, I appreciate your comments about the lack of diversity amongst musicians in the classical world. I was wondering what you thought about the lack of diversity in the repertoire of classical, and also why is there such a separation between what is considered classical and what is considered in other genres such as jazz, where some of those boundaries may really overlap.
I'm really glad that you said that. Because when I say classical, I guess it's a misnomer. I should be saying orchestral music. And part of the main performing arts series that we're going to be launching is to show the relevance of an orchestra in today's music. So that's a very good point. There are these silos or walls that are put up. I think classical musicians, here's something that all through undergrad, I mean, I do play a little jazz. It's just not my main thing. And maybe I can, blow over some 12-bar blues, but that's it. Don't ask me about rhythm changes. But there's this word that just got me from my freshman year all through, where if you're a classical musician, you're called a legit player, and then there's the jazz musician. And this wall is just like put up there. And I think, it's probably because of, the free nature of jazz music, and I guess it's sort of the origins of how some of these, things develop, where that wall is put up. And I mean, you're keying on probably, some tension there between ethnicities that was put up. I mean, if you trace back the history of jazz, you can sort of trace it back through spirituals and gospel music and all the oral tradition of how music was passed down versus classical musicians, where you train, you learn certain things, and every time you play that piece, it's the same exact thing, or it's supposed to be, or otherwise it's like, oh my gosh, that was different. But in jazz, there's that oral tradition where you hear things and you kind of go with it, you play over the changes. It's not necessarily the same each time. But that's a really good question. But it's definitely there.
As I mentioned before, my father was a jazz musician, and so when I wanted to play violin and I was learning my Suzuki pieces, I thought he would hate what I was playing, but he did not, because from his angle, I was learning Suzuki pieces, but I was learning by ear, and that was how he ingested everything. And he played in orchestras, but jazz was always his first love. It was always his preference. And he said one of the things when he was the age that I am now was helping his band break down their wall, which was there were these white boys who wanted to play with them, and the band was like, nah, they don't speak the language, they don't understand. And my father was like, well, let them try, because they have a different, they're coming from this perspective, we're coming from this perspective, and that's the beauty of jazz, is that, everyone's speaking a language, but everybody's coming in from a different angle with the solos and the interaction. And so when I picked up the violin, he was very encouraging of that, because, we had his angle, and then I had my angle, and my sister, my younger sister plays cello, but she is a singer-songwriter, pretty well, she's getting pretty well known, actually. And her music like defies any concept of any kind of genre, period. And so it was interesting how I have the jazz background and then I'm coming in with my classical background and then my sister's like floating somewhere ambiguously in the middle. But I think that's why people take to it, is because there's no limit to, there are no constraints. And I'm also really glad you asked that question.
I think there's a lot that has to do with like the origin again. So in, like I was mentioning before about this whole idea of religion as a huge part of the Black community. And I think that you mentioned Wynton Marsalis, and one of the recent things that he did, I forget the name of it, but this huge production that was based on church music. And I wish I could remember the name of it because it's really great. But whenever we think of, William Grant Still and some of these really prominent Black composers, like they're the only ones that don't base everything off of spirituals, it seems, that are of the well-known group. So William Grant Still, not so much of his stuff is really based on spirituals. If you think of Florence Price, it seems like there's a lot more spiritual-based music. And even if we look at that gap between today's Black composers and that of 80 years ago, it's there's this huge gap somewhere in the middle. And it's like, I guess that's where jazz developed into R&B and hip-hop and everything else, but that's all part of what's made our African-American culture. And I think that that's what people are afraid to admit, that that's part of classical tradition still, because many of those Black composers like William Grant Still were well trained, and Nathaniel Dad, and some of these other really not so well known but really accomplished composers that were really writing well. And I think that it's just that there's some gap in that. I don't know where I'm going with this, but basically it just has to, I don't know, we gotta figure that out.
Yeah, I have one more. I have one quick addition to this thread, which is that in the realm of new classical music, the boundaries of genre have really opened up, such that composers are writing for musicians whom they know have a really strong, let's call it legit background, and can improvise really well, and can play tabla. And so the boundaries are really opening up with composers as they're reacting to their surroundings, as well as musics from all kinds of traditions.
One more thing just to add to what he was saying. I have found myself in gigs where I'm playing contemporary music a lot lately, and I'm going to be very honest, a lot of times it's because they pay well. I have an interest in contemporary music, but because I was put in that situation. But so much of the time when I'm playing with orchestras and we are doing something contemporary with a singer, or there's something improvisational that soloist is doing, I have no way, I feel no connection to it at all. I did a series of concerts in Vermont that was supposed to be about Americana and just the experience of being a citizen. And I was just like, I have no idea. Because all I see is the person that is singing is like this product of Brooklyn, and it's just like so abstract, and this isn't like the general experience. And every time I walk into a contemporary situation, I'm with my peers who are my age, but who can't talk about race, and who, if put into a situation where they have to switch to gospel, or they're in an orchestra and they're playing with a gospel choir, it's like alien, it's so strange to them, and a lot of times not really taken seriously. Wherein if I'm doing a gig, my first time, I wasn't raised in the traditional Black church. My grandmother, very much so, but I wasn't raised that way. And so the first time I really I have always loved gospel music, but I wasn't always allowed to listen to it. And so I came to it in adulthood, and the first time we played with Soulful Symphony in Baltimore, and we played with this choir, and the conductor, Darren Atwater, he asked them for this really intense jazz chord, and he played one note, and the choir, it was like a 9-note chord, and the choir just boom, 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 boom. And the concert was, it was primarily gospel music, and I felt incomplete as a musician, because these singers had that classical training, but they also spoke a different language. And I don't want to just do that in Baltimore for a Eric Garner concert. You know, that's not the only place I want to do it. I wish that part of the contemporary music tradition would also incorporate elements of Black society, because it's here. You know, it doesn't not exist. And I think what's the most infuriating is this like celebration of new music, and this is not directed at you personally, or like living composers, but there's just a huge gap in that too. And I'm afraid that as long as that gap exists, we're not going to do anything to close the current gap in which people don't know about composers of 80 and 100 years ago. So I guess that would be kind of all in.
The one thing that I would add to this conversation is just that in terms of categorizations, it seems that there's not only categorizations between, you know, what is classical, what is gospel, but then within the world of classical music, there's Black classical composers and then everyone else. And so there's a lot of airplay for William Grant Still and Florence Price in the month of February, because it's Black History Month. But so if we could, hopefully with programs like the Dream Unfinished, where we're presenting works by not only William Grant Still, but Leonard Bernstein and the living composer Jessie Montgomery, and continuing these kinds of conversations, and we'll make a dent in all this work that we have that's left for us. We'd like to thank you all so much for staying on and joining us and listening online. And just one more plug for our big event. It's going to be July 17th at the Salvation Army Centennial Memorial Temple, which is on West 14th Street and 6th Avenue. It's going to be a phenomenal program with really talented musicians from, you know, Broadway musicians, New York Philharmonic musicians, and some incredible guest speakers that include MSNBC's Joyanne Reed. Erica Garner will be speaking, as well as the director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, Vince Warren. And this is a benefit concert that is, and the proceeds are going towards civil rights organizations. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.